Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Episode 18, an interview with Tyler Muto, Part 1. Hey everybody, welcome back to Dog Trainers Podcast, and we have a very special guest today. I'm not going to take any more time before I introduce Mr. Tyler Muto. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great.
Good. Hey, really quick. So before we dive in, I just wanted to be sure that you can find all of us on Instagram. You can find me at UNTAMEDDOGCO. That's UNTAMEDDOGCO. You can find Brent at CANISBEHAVIor. That's all one word. And you can find Tyler at Tyler_Muto, MUTO, as well as Consider the Dog. And that's Consider_the_dog. So what we wanted to talk about, man, is we're super excited to have you on. And we were listening to some other stuff that you've put out because there's so much content and you guys have done amazing work, especially like Brent was talking about just a minute ago with, regards to, I think what really helped me stand out, or help you stand out to me in particular too, was just the way that you're really clear with your markers and really clear with almost knowing when to ease up on a dog. I remember seeing an episode where you were working e-collar place with a dog and the dog thought about getting off the bed. It was like a raised kind of Karunda bed. I think he stepped off with one paw and it was something as subtle as like you took a little step in his direction, he backs up. There wasn't really much of a correction or anything. And then you explained to the camera, he thought about it and ultimately fixed himself. And I'm going to reward that instead of taking the opportunity to correct something so minor. And so, we've always been a huge fan of just how deep you've dissected dog training. And so we just wanted to kind of get your take on something that we've heard you talk about in the past, which was the term balanced dog training can easily be such a big blanket that encompasses so many trainers and training styles that it's almost too big. And maybe there's something that we can kind of do to talk about how we change that a bit moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird thing. I try not to sort of label myself as a balanced dog trainer. I honestly just prefer to say I'm a dog trainer, right?
Right.
I think labels are probably better reserved for people that, kind of go to one sort of corner or one, sort of extreme or the other. For those of us that are using all quadrants and are sort of opening ourselves up to all available tools and all available techniques, that's just dog training. Like we don't need to specify because we aren't being specific about the style that we're doing, right? So I think that for me is kind of like the best way to sort of sum that all up. The whole balance thing, it's for a long time, it just sort of came to mean anything that isn't, reward based or like reward only, I should say.
Right.
So it's like either you're an all positive or an all reward based trainer or whatever one of the dozen names that, that gets termed as, or you're a balanced trainer. And that's not really an appropriate dichotomy, right? Because there are people who call themselves balanced trainers that don't ever use, rewards. Like it's not very balanced at all, right? Or I mean, they might use some praise, but the training is way more heavily tilted towards the negative reinforcement or positive punishment end of the spectrum.
Right.
And so like that's not balance, right? And that doesn't mean it's bad, right? I mean, I've seen some trainers that are really graceful about their application of negative reinforcement, and it can be done very well. I mean, look at the bulk of, for instance, horse training, right? Throughout the years is all negative reinforcement based. It doesn't mean it has to be bad. But I think labeling that kind of thing as balanced is a little bit of a mislabel. So for me, I think, those of us who sort of use it all, I mean, that's just dog training. There's nothing special about it. We're just using whatever is available to us, and we're trying to learn more all the time. And we're trying to keep our minds open to different tools and different approaches. But yeah, it's that like either you're all positive or you're balanced. I think that's where kind of some of the trouble lies. Right. Then, of course, there are some people, I think it's a dying breed, but there are still some folks around that are, quite heavy-handed in their training. And they call themselves balanced, and it's like, not really, Right. And then those of us that are trying to be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more thoughtful, we get sort of lumped together with that. And And that can be kind of quite harmful for sort of the industry moving forward and getting out of some of the division that's been present in the past.
Yeah, that is definitely what we've seen. And I think one of my opinions, and tell me what you think on this. I think, we all started someplace, right? We started in some platform of training. I traditionally started in a Keeler version of training, right?
Mm-hmm.
I learned really early on. I was like, this works with some dogs, but then you start seeing the limits within a method, right? And
Sure.
I really worked with my mentors, and you really see people who master a specific technique who, they are graceful with a correction, or they're graceful with their timing, where they don't have to, do it so hard, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
you kind of, as a young dog trainer, I idolized like the technique, I idolized the timing, I idolized all these things, but there was always this wall that I would hit at some point where I was just like, I see where it works, and I definitely see where it doesn't work. And I think it's just that natural desire to learn more. So I remember, I call it the pendulum swing. We're always swinging from one side to the other to learn where in the middle we're supposed to be. And the reality of it is, to be a true balanced dog trainer, or whatever the concept of balanced is
Sure.
like, it's a constant ever going process, right? Like, we're still, just like you told me, before we got on, you're doing things a little bit different than you were doing a few years ago, right? So that evolution, that desire to see, okay, can I do it with least amount of force? You even you hear about like other dog trainers, like, Dr. Ian Dunbar. He talks about the way he did stuff 20 years ago. He changed his now, he doesn't do it that way anymore. And so I think, as it does take time, but there always has to be this internal commitment to get better, to try harder, okay, if you see a similar case that you were working with before, it's like, how do I maybe approach this case slightly different, right? It is technically unique in its own situation, but as dog trainers, we tend to see similar cases over and over and over. So I think it takes an intrinsic desire to get better, because I've seen dog trainers who just try and, beat a dead horse when it comes to a certain technique. And like, you can keep trying. And sometimes they're just so stuck to an ideology, or they're so stuck to a mentality, like just a very stubborn thing, that it actually ends up not being good for that specific dog.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I remember I was asked once on an interview maybe a year or so ago, for newer trainers that are coming up that sometimes feel frustrated, or they feel like they're missing pieces of the puzzle, or they run up against those walls, and they feel a little bit discouraged at times, sort of what's advice for them. And, my only advice really is just to embrace all of that, because I think that's what makes dog training interesting ultimately.
Right.
Is that it is sort of like this infinitely deep well that you seem to never get to the bottom of. And even myself, and bear in mind, I there's people out there that have been training dogs 3 times as long as I have been.
Right.
But I find myself still sometimes getting frustrated, or feeling like I'm missing something, or there's something I could be doing that can streamline things. I mean, even just the past 2-3 years,
right,
we really like overhauled a lot of what we were doing at my training center. I mean, really overhauled.
right.
We changed so much stuff because I was feeling frustrated. I was feeling like things were taking longer than they needed to. Like there was more steps involved than there needed to be. Like we weren't being direct, like somebody would come in with a behavior problem. We're sort of addressing it in this roundabout fashion, rather than just sort of like going in with a scalpel and, removing the tumor, so to speak.
Right.
So, we're always kind of trying. And I think for me, if I ever kind of got to a point where that wasn't present anymore, I'd probably be ready then to move on to a different profession. Yeah, I would get bored. I think dog training can be very intellectually stimulating if you allow it to.
Right.
Or you can be, I've known trainers that, have done things the same way for 20 years, and, that's what works for them, and
right.
They're happy, and, rock on. But for me, I personally would not be happy if that were the case. That wouldn't work with my personality type. And so I think if you're feeling like, man, like, God, there's all these people that are better than me, there's all this stuff I still got to learn. It's like, great, great. I mean, look at all this stuff. You have so much to look forward to in your career, right?
Right.
What's
That's
cool
true.
is it's an interesting thing. And I love that you bring up kind of the the frustration that a younger dog trainer would have, and kind of the idea of just embracing it in a way that I found, because I've been there too, of course, you know, I think everybody hasn't. A way that I found that made it make sense for me was like, when what you mean when you say embrace it, at least in my head, is you let the frustration push you in the direction that you need to go, which is, all right, well, now you need to pick something else up, figure out what's going on, because you'll also get the other end of the spectrum. There are the young trainers who will kind of like live and die by the method that they've learned originally. And then
Right.
you find the
course,
people
yeah.
that will like, okay, this isn't working, I immediately switch to something else. And maybe they never quite got good enough in that particular method that they didn't really reach the limit of it before they moved on. And of course, we know that in like modern training these days, it's really a blend of a lot of methods put together. You start with some really good food work with perfect timing and marking and things like that, and then you transition them over to like leash or e-collar work or whatever the case. And so it's good to be good at a lot of different methods. And I think that sometimes people are too quick to jump off of one and onto another, and so they're never really mastering anything.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's
Right.
a common thing, like in modern training, especially.
It's that
It's
training,
sort of like,
you know?
well, yeah, I mean, you know, I remember when I was kind of starting out and up and coming, like Facebook wasn't really a thing yet, and YouTube was like not really a thing yet.
Right.
There weren't that many seminars available to take. They were sort of few and far between.
Right.
And you know, you might go to a seminar if you're lucky once a year, and you know, and then you've got that whole year where you're just like, okay, I learned this thing, so I'm going to apply it in my work with my clients and see how it goes. And you know, you kind of figure out what works for you, what doesn't. You incorporate it into your existing method or style, and then
Right.
you get another opportunity to learn something else. You know, nowadays it's, again, it's a little bit of a pro and a con, because we get, I mean, I've met trainers that have been training dogs for only like 2 years that are already at a skill level that took me 6 or 7 years to get to.
Yep.
Because of the availability of information that is accessible now to everybody.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful. But I also meet a lot of people that are jumping around so much, and they're
just
not understanding how come this person contradicts this person and how does it all fit together. And they're never, you know, like you said, mastering any technique.
Yeah.
And so I think it can be good and it can be bad. You just have to be aware of that. You have to be, you know, just sort of cognizant of those pitfalls so you can prevent yourself from kind of falling victim to it, I guess, so to speak. But yeah, it is. I mean, you know, modern dog training, if you're going to do it well, is not about one method or one technique. People ask me sometimes, I get clients that say, you know, well, what method do you guys use? I say, I don't use a method, you know. Our goal is to learn as much as we can so that we can apply what's appropriate for the given dog in the given situation.
Right.
But I certainly don't have like a method. And even like, you know, last year, I put out a very detailed course on the electronic collar, because I felt like it was needed. And if you're going to use that tool, you should really understand it well. And I teach it in a very specific way, but I always tell people I teach it in that manner so that you can understand the principles. Once you understand the principles, you can be playful with your methodology. You don't have to do it the exact same way that I do it. And even the way that I work a dog is going to be different than the way I present it in a course when I'm teaching people. Because when I'm teaching people, I want people to understand the individual components. And it's kind of the same thing with like learning different methods and mastering them, right? And then you can kind of mush them all together. Well, it's the same thing with understanding the principles behind something like the electronic collar. Like when I work a dog on the e-collar, I'm very fluid jumping. I might jump from step 1 to step 5 to step 3 to step 4, you know, just going with what the dog is showing me.
Yeah.
But you can't learn it that way. You've got to learn it in a sort of mechanical way. And the only thing I can really relate it to, I've always been a big fan of John Coltrane.
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of people know him for his later work, where he was very his playing was just very almost like abstract and free flowing and not like the classical jazz. It was like this, you know, it was the 60s and 70s, right? It was this really organic style where he was really expressing himself through his instrument.
Right.
And if you don't sort of know his background, what a lot of people don't know is that the reason he became popular to begin with, the reason that, for instance, Miles Davis hired him, was because in his early career, he was known for being so technically precise because he used to just sit there and drill himself on the scales over and over and over and over again. So he took the time to learn all those individual sort of, mechanical components, so that it became so internalized that he can then mush it all together and allow himself to just fully express himself through that instrument.
Yep.
And so for me, dog training is no different. I want to really take the time to learn the mechanics, to learn the technique in a very technical way, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And get it to the point where it's internalized, where I don't have to think so much about it, so that when I work a dog, I can really just be present with the dog and just let the experience sort of flow out of me.
Right.
And there's many times where I'm working with either one of my staff, or I'm coaching another professional at a seminar or a shadow program or something like that, where they're working the dog, and I say, I need to take the leash. And it's not because they're doing something wrong and I feel like I need to take over. It's because I can't tell them what to do until I'm right there with the dog, present, physically connected, and I'm sort of in the moment. And then I can just see what comes out, and then I go, okay, here's what I ended up doing. You know what I mean? But it's hard for me to like stand back from an outsider perspective. I need to be fully in it,
Yeah. And that's so I read one of the best books I've read in the last 10 years was a book called The Talent Code. Are you familiar?
Oh, it's a great book. Yeah, great book.
And in there, they refer to exactly what you're talking about as your matrix of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And they talk about matrix, the schematics and the understandings and the neuroconnectors that you've created in your brain that to you is now an impulse or an instinct, right? The same way when we condition dogs, we're trying to condition them to just accept the behavior right away, right? And not having to think too much about it. And I think that's one of the big things is in balanced dog training, you actually have to work on those technical skills, like you're saying, till it becomes muscle memory, till it becomes in your body, till you know it in your body, right? Because I remember, we started. So me and Mariano started at a kennel. I was the training manager at a kennel when he started, and I can't explain like how much daycare work really helped me with timing, body language. Being on top of a situation, social pressure, body pressure, all that type of stuff that you use to control a herd of dogs. How much that helped me connect to certain leash training techniques, or just the timing of how to interrupt a behavior when you need to, right? So like everything eventually gets interconnected, and you start seeing this huge web of information that only makes sense to you, right? And so, but the beautiful part about teaching, what they refer to in that book, they call them master coaches. Master coaches are constantly trying to perfect their craft, but master coaches are able to, in the moment, just like you have this empathic connection with the dog or that student, and you say, right now, giving all the variables that I'm seeing playing out, I need you to do this. And they're able to take that direction right away. They see the result, and then they go, oh, and then after the fact, you explain why you did that. Right. And so they have to take that bit of knowledge, put that into their matrix. Right. And it comes down to the more dogs you train, the bigger all those connectors start connecting to each other. And we start actually making sense of this information web in our brain, which is beautiful. Right. It's that is what makes us professionals. Right. The fact that we keep seeking that out.
Yeah.
You know what's funny too is we were just talking. Well, by we I mean my roommate and I. We both do jiu-jitsu and boxing and a couple other things, and we were just kind of laughing about this because, of course, with the whole everything being shut down, that goes for the gyms as well, and the jiu-jitsu gyms have slowly started opening back up, and so we've gone back to to training here and there on a limited basis. And we were talking about instructors. There are some that they're amazing in and of themselves. They're like high-level black belts that are just competition tested, and they're good. But sometimes they have a hard time explaining something. They'll be like, okay, grab this leg here, that leg there. And then they'll say something that doesn't really mean anything. It'll be like, boom, pow. And it's like, yeah, but what is boom type thing? So it is funny that being good at something is kind of a different skill than being good at teaching it to someone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And that's the difference, I guess, between great educators and not great educators.
Yeah. And there are also people that are great coaches that aren't necessarily great at the thing they are coaching. You know what I mean? So like not every all-star basketball coach is actually a great basketball player. Right. You know what I mean? So there are certain aspects of dog training that I am certainly not the best person to implement.
Right.
But I'm really good at telling you what needs to happen. Like, I'm really good at telling you what to do, although I may not be the best person to actually do it, you know? And that goes with just about anything, right?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think, especially in dog training, you know, our communication with the animals is so important, but our communication to the humans is extremely important as well. And that's always something that I focused a lot on early in my career was, you know, how do I articulate this in a way that is super clear?
Mm-hmm.
And sort of like on a two-way basis, you know, as well. You know, one of the things that I see a lot when I'm coaching other dog trainers and they're working with clients, we see sometimes where the client asks a question and the trainer answers a question that wasn't asked, right? Like they answer a question that's different from the one that was asked because they weren't truly listening to what was said.
Mm-hmm.
And so being precise in both your speaking, but also in your listening,
right,
are extremely important things. For me, I think that sort of obsession with precise language is sort of deep rooted in me. I've spoken about this before. Some people don't know, but I grew up with actually a really terrible stutter. So when I was young in elementary school, middle school, high school, I didn't really grow out of it until sort of midway through college. I had a very bad stutter, which gave me terrible social anxiety, extreme fear of public speaking, like paralyzing fear of public speaking to the point where I just wouldn't do it. You know, I was ridiculed when I was young. And so when you have a stutter and you know, like you can tell, or at least for me, you know, because different people have different, you know, their stutter may manifest differently. But for me, I could tell when I was going to get stuck on a word. And so I would have to come up with different ways to say things and make sure that I wasn't using, you know, more words than what were necessary. Became like a really big thing, obviously.
Right.
And so I think on sort of a subconscious level, when I, you know, kind of grew out of my stutter, I'm one of the people that are fortunate enough that it didn't carry over into adulthood. You know, being able to speak freely was such a privilege and such a blessing.
Right.
That I took it really seriously. You know, being able to speak in public in front of a crowd was like, oh my God, like I can do this.
Right on.
Is something that was like just such a huge thing that, and I was always so envious of people that were really skilled public speakers. Like you guys mentioned that you're having Michael Ellis on pretty soon on your podcast. I don't know if that's a spoiler alert or anything like that.
No, you're good.
You're good.
But you know, he's so articulate. He's
Yep.
such an incredible public speaker, and I really admire that. Anytime I see somebody that is just, you know, can just speak with such clarity and such precision in their thoughts and in their meaning, that just really stands out to me, and it's something that I admire a lot.
Yeah. Well, always it's like game respects game, you know, and it's, you know, you're a great educator. You're a master educator yourself, you know, and
I appreciate that.
That's really what it is we work. I always tell people, I said, dog trainers should work really hard to make things make sense. They should work really hard. Right. Yeah. And one thing that you actually brought up that just struck in my mind, I remember being a younger dog trainer, right. Where you have a lot of like, knowledge in the sense of how things should be. You just don't necessarily know how to articulate it into those exact precise words. Right. And this tends to be a tell for a really, young or a really novice dog trainer is they talk a lot. They talk a lot, right? And they talk a lot in the sense of they're telling you ideas, ideals, goals, but they're not explaining to you how to get there, right? And I see this a lot. So I think those of you guys who are listening who are dog trainers really work on breaking down what it is you're what are the component pieces, try and understand what this matrix is. And sometimes the only way that you actually figure out, oh, this was the missing stepping stone, or this was the missing piece to the explanation, is actually just training the dogs, right? I was fortunate enough to grow up in a facility for 10 years, right? Before I even started my own business. So we had training dogs, you know, I can proudly say we've done probably like 3,000 dogs because I worked in a facility, right? I put my hands on over 3,000 dogs, and that's practice. And every dog is different, and you have to be so dynamic, and you have to, you know, you just have to. And what I really love about what you do, and you know, I can definitely say we have, you know, kindred spirits in a way, because the empathy, the connection to that dog, the ability to read that body language is just so important. And some people have that skill naturally, And some people, they have to learn to develop it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's an important, thing that you sort of hit on there. I've been asked before, when I'm hiring staff, like if I could only pick one quality when I'm hiring a trainer, and I always say the most important quality for me is empathy and compassion. If you don't have the ability to put yourself in the dog's position and then also in the client's position, then you're never going to make it in this field. You've got to have the ability to see the world through somebody else's eyes.
Yeah.
Or you're going to be sort of, forever limited, especially if you're doing behavior work. I mean, if you're just doing obedience, you'll get by. But if you really want to do behavior work and you want to do it well and you want to not get bit, then you really have to be able to understand, how is the dog experiencing this? And then once you understand that, a lot of times the answers become very clear to you. The other thing that I would add, you mentioned like, hey, if you're struggling with, kind of articulating or putting the thing into a process, write it down. You write down what you do. You guys, mentioned earlier, some of my courses that I've produced with Learberg and stuff like that. And I can't even express how illuminating of an experience it was when I had to put those courses together for Learberg. And they've got a really great operation over there. And when I was getting ready to do my first course with them, they sent me this whole packet. I had to break things down. I had to have a whole outline for the course, and then I had to break things down like shot by shot, so that when I showed up to film, because we had only a few days, they're flying me in to film, that we knew exactly what shots we needed to get, what the scene needed to be, whether I needed a dog or not, what kind of dogs I needed, what other equipment I needed. We had to organize all that ahead of time. Now, you don't necessarily have to go that deep, but even creating like a rough outline of like, okay, I'm going to teach place command or whatever it is you want to be doing. And then writing down the steps and then like actually seeing if those steps make sense and the order of operations. And I can't tell you how many times when I'm like planning a video out that I'm shooting, that I get it all outlined and I go, wait a minute, I should do step 5 before step 3. I've been doing that. Wow, this should be. And then it's like, wow, I've been doing that wrong. And I didn't realize it until I put it on paper. And then the other thing that I found really valuable when I was first starting out, when I was younger, I used to go to seminars, or I'd go and just, I'd go travel out just to train with somebody for a few days. And I'd call my wife every night. And my wife's not a dog trainer. I'd call her every night and I would explain to her what I learned. And if I couldn't explain it to her in a way that she could understand what I was talking about, then I haven't fully grasped.
That's
what it is. You know what I mean?
That is definitely a technique that I used a lot. When I was a younger dog trainer, I had I was able to explain knowledge that I learned as if I knew it for years, and so having this ability to learn it and explain it. But I totally get you. If you couldn't explain it thoroughly where it made sense to somebody else, it's like I should either go back to it or watch it again. Actually, I'm pretty confident I did that with your leash reactivity video. I did that. I watched it about 3 times.
And sometimes just the process of explaining it and the process of articulating it is what brings those ideas together and what solidifies your understanding and makes those logical connections between things. And if you never take the time to articulate it back out in a clear and concise way, as opposed to like broken up over 8 sessions over 8 weeks or whatever you're doing with a client, then you might not ever get to that full picture. But teaching is one of the best ways to learn.
100%. And the funny sorry, I just want last thing. The funny thing is, sometimes when you're a young dog trainer, you want to teach them the way you would train the dog versus the way they need to learn to train the dog. Because there's a lot of, as you mentioned, there's a lot of not steps that are skipped, but there's a lot of windows and pockets that we see in training where we can say, okay, the window's open. I'm going to take that. And we just saved ourselves, a day and a half of work because we were able to see that window. Right. So sorry, go ahead, Mariano.
No, you're good. Well, that's the trick, right? That's when you get good enough at something, you learn how to kind of play with it. Because what I notice in anything that's as like dense and something that you'll never really master, like a martial art or a sport or something, I notice that like when you're not good, when you're brand new, you don't really know anything, so you're just kind of learning and you're really meticulous about what you do. Once you're still new, but you kind of have a game plan, so to speak, you just go for that game plan. And when things get off the rails, you try to find your way back to that game plan. When you get better, you play around with it. So it's like, okay, well, I'll work on this, kind of seeing what's going to happen, because I know that just based on the dog and the information at hand here, if something ends up not being what I wanted it to be, we can work backwards. It's all good. Or we can make lateral moves to kind of get us back to where we need to go. And I also wanted to touch on, just for our dog trainer friends who listen to this, it's definitely a good idea to just write stuff out, talk about it. Like, just me and Brent have been talking about this for like our past 3 or 4 episodes. It's crazy how, we did 5 episodes just deep diving into certain types of training methods and things. And we do that, and then like the next day you luck out and somebody asks you like, hey, so a question regarding e-collar, and it's like, I just spent like 90 minutes talking about that last night, so let me tell you. And like it does help you kind of sharpen your explanations, and it does make you quicker. So a little game that I like to play is, for a newer dog trainer, take a topic, something that you understand or would like to understand better, or at least would like to be able to explain better outwardly. Maybe you understand it, but you can't make others get it. Write it out and be detailed with it, and then try to make it shorter and shorter and shorter and still make sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I wanted to kind of prompt, I had this thing that came into my head. So we talk about different styles of dog training, what they are, again, styles and techniques, there's kind of like an overlap a little bit, right? When it comes to terminology. So, I mean, if we were to really try and paint this picture for people who are learning dog training methods, like, or like, ideas in dog training, like, what is it? Like, how would we paint that out? Like, we know Keeler method is a thing. We know agility work is a thing. Competitive food work is a thing. We know marker training is, I think marker training has kind of been thrown into most formats of training these days, right?
Yeah.
And we start saying like e-collar is a slightly it's an offset of, escape avoidance training, or Keeler method. Just, so like, how would you paint the picture, Tyler? If we were to kind of look at, okay, if we were going to paint a picture, like if this was a color palette, what are the colors?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. And, like I always tell people, like, I'm kind of like a principle-based trainer as opposed to a method-based trainer. And so I would say, if we were to kind of paint that picture, I would focus first on principles, right?
Yeah.
So if you're doing anything such as agility, competitive obedience, anything like that, like you're definitely going to want to make sure you really understand the ins and outs of positive reinforcement, negative punishment, right? And you really want to understand why does positive reinforcement work? Why do clickers work?
Right.
Why do they sometimes not work? Right. So focus on those principles first. And then same thing, like regardless whether you're doing e-collar, whether you're a leash and prong collar trainer, or you like slip leads, or you like halties, or you're really into learning how to use your body language and do work with packs of dogs, well, then really make sure you understand negative reinforcement really, really well.
Right.
Because if you understand it doesn't matter whether it's an e-collar or a prong collar or a halty or your body language or a squirt bottle, or it just doesn't matter, right? You're applying the principle in different ways.
Right.
You know what I mean?
So using tools. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So that would be my starting point personally. I think, the biggest things right off the bat, like really understand positive reinforcement and really understand negative reinforcement, because you can do like 90% of dog training with those two quadrants.
Yes. And if you make a mistake, you can learn from it,
Exactly. But it's really important to understand all of it. And I think, one of the biggest problems that we've had in dog training is, like, even the dog training schools that are out there that are teaching, prong collar and e-collar, most of those schools, I won't say all, but most of the schools are not teaching it in a technically correct manner. Like, they're not teaching it in a way that's in alignment with what we know of the decades of research on animal learning.
Right.
So they're teaching using e-collars in a way that is not consistent with the principles of negative reinforcement and positive punishment.
Right.
And like, therein lies the rub, and why you see all these like negative fallout, start to happen from it. And so it's like, before you worry about learning e-collar, it's like, well, let's just understand what negative reinforcement is, and how you apply it, and why it works, and why sometimes it doesn't work. And I think the more you focus on that stuff, again, then you can be playful. And that's really like the end goal, is to be fluid and to be playful, but getting the principles down behind it, and then you're just learning like, okay, so if I'm going to apply negative reinforcement with an e-collar, okay, what do I need to know about the e-collar specifically? What do I need to know about the leash, from just a mechanical standpoint at that point? Then it's just, just physically, what do I need to do? But the timing and the principle behind it is all the same. Ultimately, one of my mentors, Bart Bellin, I remember one of the first times I saw him, he said, "There's nothing new in dog training." He basically says, he's like, in at least 50 years, there's nothing new.
Right.
There's just different ways of applying. There's creative ways of applying, but there's nothing new. Like the principles don't change. The principles have been there since cognizant, sentient beings evolved, right? So
since we domesticated the wolf, pretty much it's existed.
Yeah, since before that, since before human beings.
Right.
Since animals were able to learn from cause and effect,
right?
Those principles have existed. It doesn't change. You're just coming up with creative and unique ways of applying those principles.
Right.
Even if you watch somebody like Cesar Millan, the thing about Cesar that's really interesting is Cesar probably doesn't, in a sort of academic way, understand negative reinforcement, but for whatever reason, he does use it pretty correctly. Like he's pretty accurate in his application, even though he doesn't understand it from a technical standpoint. And some people are like that's going to happen, right? Like there are people that never went to art school that can be master painters.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But if you're not, born with a gift, right? So Caesar's really good at using negative reinforcement. He's terrible at using positive reinforcement. So he was born with the gift of understanding negative reinforcement, or his upbringing, whatever. But he's not great at positive reinforcement. So if you're not one of those people that was born with that gift, then just take the time to, and you can learn. I'm never going to be able to do exactly what Caesar does. He's a very unique sort of being in the way his presence, but I don't want to either. Like I don't agree with everything he does. I think he's great. I do think he's skilled. I have no problems with him. But I don't agree with everything everybody, like anybody does,
There's every dog trainer I've talked to, they're like, yeah, we secretly are fans of Cesar Millan in some type of way. Like we appreciate him in the dog world, because I guarantee, my particular story, when I was 18, I watched every episode of The Dog Whisperer, I watched.
I don't care what side of the fence you fall on either when it comes to methods. All of us owe a little bit of our financial success to Cesar Millan.
100%.
Because he really made it clear to the public that you can resolve these issues, and that dog training is more than just sit down, stay.
100%.
And that it can be deeper. And boy, the public views dog training way differently now than they did pre-Caesar.
Right.
And
it
is, all of us have nice careers, and
because
a little bit of that is credited to the awareness that Caesar brought to how diverse dog training can really be.
And he did. And one thing I liked, he kind of put on blast how dumb we can be sometimes as people.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I think that's really appropriate. Now, I remember growing up as a dog trainer, people would be like, Brent, what do you do? And I'd be like, I'm a dog trainer. Guess what the next thing that comes out of their mouth is? They go, like Cesar Millan.
Like Cesar Millan.
I got that just the other day.
All the time. And I'm like, no, I'm a dog trainer. Right. And it's just funny, but like much love to Cesar Millan. I'd love to have him on the podcast one day. That'd be fun.
Yeah. Well, you know what I noticed too about Cesar is, I think the thing that he really did that like helped dog training just explode was he kind of blew the lid off of the whole understanding of the owner matters a lot too. Because the stuff that we saw before then, because you're right, YouTube wasn't really, it was around, but it wasn't really a thing. Because
it was before Caesar. It was like Uncle Matty. It was Barbara Woodhouse.
Yeah.
Right. But it was very much to the point. Like I'd watch all that old stuff too, and it's like, this is how you teach your dog sit with a choke chain. It wasn't like, what do you do when, it wasn't as dynamic as like, okay, so it's not just the reactive Great Dane, it's the Great Dane with these owners, and then the neighbor called in. There's this whole there's this kind of extra aspect of it of you have to approach the owners themselves and see what it is that even allowed the dog to get to this point. Are you guys, are you reinforcing the wrong things? Are you afraid of setting boundaries and structuring the dog? Do you not exercise? And I think that was kind of that missing component. The dog trainers were like, yes, thank you. And then finally, it allowed people to understand the whole picture. And that was kind of my, or it still is to this day, I think, is my personal favorite part of dog training. Is it's a lot of fun learning the methods and all that. And I know that we were talking about people earlier who like, they're just content with one style and can just go. I've always been like secretly jealous of those people because I get bored. So, like for me, like actual hands-on dog work can be monotonous. So like I have to put my headphones on or something and just work them. And, but the stuff where you're dealing with an owner who's for one reason or another under duress, or they're unsure, or they have like some medical issue, and you have to get creative with solutions, that I think was something that at least helped me kind of separate myself from the area around here. And that's something that I really enjoy talking about whenever we get the chance. It's like being good hands-on with the dog is obviously, it's vital, but learning how to kind of play and be creative with the owners and that relationship and just the overall environment and the routine and the structure and the playtime and everything in between.
Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast. Join us again next week for part 2 of our interview with Tyler Muto, where we go more in depth on principle-based dog training, and we discuss Tyler's passion project called ConsiderTheDog.com.